So today I'm going to talk about the Asian Games, and Romy took you through a very, very thorough history of sport in the Asian region, and I found that very interesting indeed. I think you'll find that as we in the UK, and certainly before I came out to this side of the world, I was more aware perhaps than you of what happens in sport in this time of the world, because obviously you might tell from my accent that I spent a lot of time in Australia, and I've also spent a lot of time in the Pacific region and also in the Asia region as a result of that. So I do know about the Asian Games, and I do know about a lot of what's happened in sport in Asia. It's an exciting part of the world, and what is so exciting about it is just how much it's changed and developed in a really relatively short period of time. They know how to do things out in this part of the world. It's a very modern, very fast-moving society, and it really is quite exciting to be a part of it. So by the end of this particular session, you should know who owns the Games, a bit of a history about the Asian Games, what they stand for, who participates in them, what has proliferated from these Games, and kind of understand their importance to the world of sport. Romy's already talked to you about the Olympic Games, and she mentioned the Games of Japan that Tokyo hosted in 1964 and again in 2020, Beijing in 2008, and of course Seoul in 1988. And Tokyo hosted the 1958 Asian Games, and it was an opportunity for them to put a rehearsal together and start putting the infrastructure they needed at that time to be able to host successfully an Olympic Games. The same thing happened with Seoul. They hosted the Asian Games 2 years prior to the 1988 Games in 1986. Beijing hosted the Asian Games in 1990, but that was still a taster for them in terms of getting themselves ready for hosting what was an exceptional 2008 Olympic Games. And more now we're seeing Asian destinations for Olympic sports, with Beijing hosting the Winter Games, the first time ever. And also for, well, not quite the first time, Japan has hosted the Winter Games, but in recent memory. And also the Tokyo Games that were hosted last year after being postponed due to the COVID epidemic. So it's an important Games. It's enabled countries in this part of the world to prepare themselves, prepare their athletes to qualify for Olympic competition, as well as to understand how to host the Games. And in doing that, build infrastructure and build the kind of sport facilities. I've broken the lecture down into 3 themes, not too many slides, and I'm going to talk quite a lot. But as I said, if you want to stop and discuss at any point, then I'm happy to do that. Now, you'll notice that in each slide, I've got a set of notes to support the slides. So you're welcome, if you've downloaded the slides, to look at the notes page, and you can see the notes there. I've also prepared a learner guide that will help you to study. If you've managed to, or you're able to download the learner guide and perhaps make some notes in the lecture as you go through, that might help you prepare and maybe even provide some information for you for a possible assignment topic for you at the end of the course. So the first Asian Games actually occurred in 1951, and they were held in Delhi. Now, at this time in history, we were seeing a lot of decolonization take place. And one of the major countries in the region to decolonize was India and Pakistan, but particularly India, as having the second largest population in the world, was keen to see some kind of a sporting event take place that could bring together the nations of the Asian continent. And the Asian continent being very much a part of the colonial era up until the World War II. With the ending of World War II, that colonial process kind of dropped away, except, of course, for the presence of American soldiers. Although not strictly looking after colonies, they have had and still have quite a strong presence in Asia through military bases and things like that, but it was a different situation. Up until World War II, the British, of course, had a large influence over many of the territories of Asia as they were known, and later countries like India, Pakistan, Burma, in particular Singapore, and Malaysia were all under British rule of some description. They had a strong influence in China and, of course, owned Hong Kong for up until relatively recently. France had Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and around that part of the world. And the Dutch had the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. And all of these countries kind of just emerged post-World War II as it became less and less viable for the European countries to maintain these colonies out in this part of the world. And since World War II, the region has grown at an incredible rate. So the Asian Games were seen as an initiative of the Indians, really, to do something that would bring the people together. Now, there'd already been a history of games anyway in the Far East, and they were known as the Far Eastern Games, and they date back to about 1913. The British very much encouraged this kind of competition and these kinds of events as a way of developing that sort of sense of identity of being part of the British Empire and so on. But as I said, that all changed afterwards. Now, the first Asian Games organized by a group called the Asian Games Federation. So this is prior to there being national Olympic committees set up in this part of the world. The Olympic movement itself was still very Euro-centered and Eurocentric, with the exception of the American countries and on the continent of America. And so the need to form an organization that would be the, if you like, the coordinator or the owner of the Asian Games was, and they were called the Asian Games Federation. A similar process existed in the Oceania region, where they had what was called the South Pacific Games Council, and that still exists today. Their multi-sport games are not run by ONOC or the Oceania National Olympic Committees. They still have a separate games body, as does the Americas and as does the African continent. So it's quite interesting that the Asian continent was able to, by 1981, once OCA, or the Olympic Council of Asia, was formed, were then able to evolve out of the Asian Games Federation and pretty much continue the work of the multi-sport games, the Asian Games themselves, as well as involve the Olympic movement in what was going on. Now, in my experience, I would suggest to you that the OCA has probably done the best of any of the regional or continental Olympic bodies, or in fact, any of the regional sport bodies, in terms of evolving the games. They very early on understood the value of owning a multi-sport event. And it was for that reason that they were able to continue on with it. And they had the full support of all of the current nations of the Asian region, as well as the emerging nations of the Asian region, which from 1980 onwards, there was a huge number of new NOCs that joined into the Olympic movement. And some of that was around the politics to do with the Moscow Olympic Games in 1980, but particularly the Los Angeles Games in 1984 that were boycotted by the Soviet Union and the Soviet states. And that stimulated the Americans to go out and, if you like, make sure that a number of their territories, and if they weren't fully formed at that point, colonies, would form national Olympic committees and then take part in the Los Angeles Games strictly for the reason so that they could say they had the biggest games ever, despite the Soviet Union not being there. But the huge advantage that the Asian Games have by being owned by the OCA is that they are able to harness some of the resources of the Olympic movement and the Olympic Games into it. And for that reason, they've modeled their games very much on the Olympic Games, and to such a point that even the type of facilities and the whole ceremonies approach to it that you see in the Olympics is almost exactly replicated in the Asian Games. Now, the Asian Games were, I would say, the most innovative games in the world in terms of multi-sport games. The OCA is headquartered in Kuwait, so it's in a fairly neutral location, and it's managed to avoid a lot of political issues by doing that. But it always showed an incredible appreciation for the value of multi-sport games, seen as a strategic tool for developing the economic side of the region, as well as binding together the region more politically, so that it could form a very strong and powerful socio-political and economic bulwark against the likes of Europe and America, the USA in particular. So sport was being used as its primary vehicle for meeting its own objectives, which was to spread the Olympic movement and to spread the values of Olympism, as well as to encourage people to play sport. Organized sport throughout Asia had been done traditionally pre-World War II, as Romy pointed out, through British influences initially, post-World War II by the Americans and by American missionaries who brought different sports in, but also did a lot of the organization of what was going on in sport. Because Asia was a largely rural economy in those years, as we know from our own history, if you recall back to the first lectures in this series, when Britain and when Europe were largely rural, the organization of sport was fairly haphazard or ad hoc. And it wasn't until industrialization came in that people had more time and there was a place for a more structured form of sport that could help to overcome some of the disadvantages of losing your sense of community and etc. by living in big cities and things like that. So it seems to be a pattern all over the world that as an economy develops, so there is a place for more organized sport. And for the Asian region, that's been since World War II. So the key dates that we need to understand about the Asian Games then, the Asian Games Federation started in 1949, and the first games were held in Delhi in 1951. They're held every 4 years since 1954. The second games were held only 3 years later because they were keen to kind of get it moving, but in order to align, even at that stage, align themselves with the Olympic cycle, because everybody immediately recognized the value of these particular games for helping those countries that were already going to the Olympics to prepare their athletes to go to the Olympics. That evolution then enabled the games to grow very quickly, to the point now where you could argue that it's the largest multi-sport games in the world, at least in terms of elite sport it is. I think the largest multi-sport event in the world is the World Masters Games. But if you look at elite Olympic competition, the Asian Games is way ahead of everybody else, including the Olympic Games. They host more sports and many more athletes than the Olympics do. And so for 1951, to give you a sense of the growth, 1951, there were 11 participating countries and 6 sports. So it wasn't particularly big, but neither were the Olympics when they first started. The first games under the mantle of the OCA, Olympic Council of Asia, had 33 participating countries and 23 sports plus 2 exhibition sports. Those exhibition sports were indigenous sports to this region. I think Sepak and Kabaddi were those on that occasion. And a couple of those unique sports to this region have been included in Asian Games since then anyway. By 2022, there were 45 participating countries in 42 sports. They made the proposal, which were in Jakarta in 2018, a proposal to include esports and breakdancing was made, and so they will appear. I think potentially as many as 8 esports will be included on the program for the 2022 Asian Games. Now might be a surprise to you, but it's not to me, because Asia actually already had an esports games going in this part of the world since around 2008. They've been playing around with this kind of thing. So to actually join it into the mainstream of the sport just seemed to be a logical development, if you like. The question that I put to you on this slide is, what do you think has been the influence of the OCA on the expansion of the Games since 1982? Now, to answer that question, you really will need to go away and find out a bit more about the Olympic movement. Maybe revise those lectures on the IOC and what it does, as well as the Olympic movement in its role. The Olympic movement has been an incredibly powerful force for globalization of sport, and you would argue that the OCA, as an integral part of the Olympic movement, has been an even more powerful influence on the globalization of sport throughout Asia, not only bringing in what we know as traditional sports, but also in the globalization of sports that were very popular in the Asian region, and looking towards having them appear on the world stage in bigger events in the future. It's pretty hard to get into the Olympic Games as it is, but it won't surprise me, and I believe there's already been talk about esports being included on the Olympic Games program in the not too distant future, and sports like breakdancing and other kind of traditional sports. Sepak Takraw, for example, at one stage was going to be included as part of the volleyball program because it has some similarities in character to volleyball, but unfortunately the International Volleyball Federation didn't accept ultimately to take on Sepak Takraw, and so it's still left in the wilderness. But there does seem to be some influence in it taking on board. So you need to have a think about why the formation of a Continental Olympic Committee, which is a grouping of national Olympic committees. Why would the formation of a Continental Olympic Committee have such a strong effect on the growth of sport in the Asian region? Okay. The very simple answer, but you can go away and read up more about this, is a thing called Olympic solidarity. And that is the use of funding raised from the selling of the media rights to the Olympic Games, which is used to help develop sport throughout the region. And by establishing national Olympic committees in each of these Asian countries, the organization of sport had something to focus around. And so by them becoming part of a collective group, which was the OCA, or the Olympic Council of Asia, which has traditionally been very strongly subsidized by Arab countries, and because it's headquartered in Kuwait, by Kuwait in particular, it has benefited from quite substantial amounts of development funding for all different aspects of sport. And that's not to mention, of course, the Asian region has grown so much in the last 40 years and even the last 20 years. I'll give you a non-sports example. This city of 21 million people, 20 years ago had no metro, no underground rail system. It now has a underground rail system, which is the 4th largest in the world, and it only took 20 years to do. And they're expanding it tens of kilometers every year. A new line is about to open up, I think, at the end of this year, which will be 30 kilometers long. And it just keeps going and going. So these people know how to grow, and they grow very, very fast. All right, performances. So the activity that I had planned for you, but I'm not sure you'll have time to do, but I think you should try and do it either in your own time and get together with a few people if you're interested in these games. I've put together in the learner guide the medal tallies and the presence of which countries have taken part in different games. You can get a lot of it on this website, the owlywiki.com, which is available on the slides and from the learner guide itself. And you need to be able to answer these questions. So how many countries have attended all 18 versions of the game? I'm going to ask that question just to see if anyone's awake. Does anybody know the answer to that? There's been 18 versions of the Summer Asian Games since 1951. And how many countries have actually attended all 18? Anybody like to guess? No one? Can someone type, 11? Yeah, not a bad guess. It's less than 11, it's more than 4, but good try. It's less than 6. That's right. 5 countries have attended all games going back to 1951, and I'll leave it to you to find out which ones they are. If you look on this website here, the Asian Games Medal Tally, then you'll be able to count. You'll see it tells you which countries have attended 18 games, 17 games, and so on. Who are the top 3 medal-winning countries of all time? Anybody like to hazard a guess? If you go to the website, you'll actually get it, but you can guess if you want. If you were talking about the Olympics, you'd put USA first because they are way ahead. China, South Korea, Japan, well done. And they are the top 3 medal-winning countries of all time. And what makes China so incredible is that they actually only appeared in the Asian Games relatively recently. They've only attended 12 Asian Games, and they have won way more medals than anybody else. So the question there is, why do you think that might be the case? And why is it that South Korea and Japan have won so many medals? Another question for you, and this is something if you are studying multi-sport games, which I think is a fascinating question, because if you look at the all-time medal-winning countries, whether it's the Olympic Games, Asian Games, Pacific Games, or the European Games really don't count because they're not of any significance, Pan American Games, if you look at the medal tallies for these types of multi-sport events, the repeating pattern we see is that there are 3, 4, or 5 countries that win pretty much all of the medals. It's almost like the state of the world economy, that the top 10% people who earn money own 90% of the wealth, and the rest are 10% of the wealth. And it's very much like that in multi-sport games. The top 10% of countries in any region involved in the multi-sport games seem to win about 80 to 90% of all of the medals that have been available over the time. And that it may just be that that's got something to do with the relative wealth that these countries have. You can't say population because India has the 2nd largest population on the planet, and its performance in Asian Games competition is quite mediocre, as it is even in the Olympic Games. So it's not about population size. It's definitely more about economy and wealth. And with that, I suppose, having an economic infrastructure that encourages people to take part in sport. Now, how many countries have not yet won a gold medal at the Asian Games? Now, this is also a theme. If anyone would like to guess, have a go. This is also a characteristic of even the Olympic Games. There are still countries around the world that have been involved in the Olympic Games for at least 10 times that have never won a gold medal. So winning a gold medal in these kinds of events is quite difficult, especially if some of the countries that are involved are sporting juggernauts and are able to enter into every single sporting event and have an organized system where that enables great success in the games as they go along. Okay. I think it's an excellent discussion, and it might even be that it could pique some interest as to an essay topic for because I think it's an issue, and it's an issue for the international federations to consider when it comes to how their sport is, how people perform in their sport all over the world. There's a word called competitive balance that we use in sport. And we could say, or we could suggest, for example, that multi-sport games really lack a competitive balance. China, for example, have topped the medal tally in the Asian Games just about every time, except for the first or second time that they took part, but certainly the last 10 times they have topped the medal tally and topped it by a long way. Before that, it was Japan. They topped the medal tally pretty much every time. At the Olympic Games, it's usually the USA. Even when they don't host it, they still top the medal tally. The exception to that was Beijing, when China managed to beat them in 2008. But otherwise, I can't recall the USA not being #1 on the medal tally in the Olympic Games, except where they haven't gone, and that was in 1980 in Moscow. So why is that? Is it just a straight relationship between the economics of that country and their sophistication as an industrialized country? Is it to do with the cultures and the variance in culture between the different countries? Just what is it? It's a good discussion to have as sports studies students, and a good thing for you to ponder about, very simply because what is sport all about if it's not about fair play for everybody? Everybody theoretically should have an equal right and an equal opportunity to win medals in any competition. But quite clearly, if you look at the results from multi-sport games, that's not always the case. And in many sports, it's not even the case in the World Championships, where the same handful of countries tend to keep winning their competitions. Why would that be a problem, do you think? Now, on the slide, and you'll notice on most slides, you'll see this little star logo here. And you'll see that logo always appears on the logos associated with anything to do with the Olympic Council of Asia. So that's the Olympic Council of Asia logo, but the star will also appear on any of the games logos that you might come across. So keep an eye out for that as well. So if you can see here, the 18th Asian Games have this little logo in the corner as well. The SEA Games have their own entity, and they don't have that particular logo. The Asian Games are definitely owned as a product of the AOCA, and therefore they will carry that logo, and any organizing committee will need to carry that logo, much as in the same way that any organizing committee of an Olympic Games will have the Olympic rings in their game logo as well. All right, so going on a bit further with the milestones, and I think this is particularly interesting as we get into the third theme. Hang on, make sure I'm right. The proliferation of the games. One of the characteristics, and it's some of this was done by the OCA itself, and others just by the subsets or the sub-regions of Asia, would realize that, sometimes that the Asian Games themselves were just too big for them, and they needed to have their own games in order to survive. And there are 5 sub-regional games that have existed, don't all exist now. They include the West Asian Games, which were around from 1997 to 2005. And that was for countries sort of around the Arab region and Jordan, that sort of area of the world that were just a bit far away from the rest of Asia, and thought that they might get something going where they could get some competition happening and also host games with a view to build up their infrastructure for either hosting or taking part in Olympic Games. The Southeast Asian Games still going strong, and they were one of the earliest ones ever formed. In fact, they started around the same time as the Asian Games, not long after. That's because it was a very vibrant part of the world, very sudden decolonization effect, and they wanted to have their own games. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, those kind of countries all take part in the Southeast Asian Games. And if you ever get a chance to go to either the SEA Games or the Asian Games, I would strongly recommend it. It's fantastic. The South Asian Games are still on the books as being live, but there's been no attempt to organize or set up for another one. But they've been around since 1984 until 2019 were the last ones. Perhaps they'll revive once COVID settles down. But they are more for India, Pakistan, and the subcontinent, if you like, Myanmar and places like that, with a view to giving them more opportunities to compete and develop infrastructure. The East Asian Games went from 1993 to 2013, and the Central Asian Games and the East Asian Games definitely can link all that way back to 1913 as well, but they've been kind of absorbed into the Asian Games because the powerhouses of the East Asian Games, being Japan, Korea, and China, prefer to put their energies into the Asian Games. And the Central Asian Games, like the West Asian Games, kind of only lasted a short time because they just found not to be very viable. As countries have become more mobile, it's become much more possible and feasible, if you like, to have these games go ahead. But where the OCA has really made a difference, maybe these other games were more the initiative of the regional subsets of Asia, the OCA realized that it had an incredible product in the Asian Games, but like the Olympics, it was becoming too big to handle. And there was always a demand for more sports to be hosted, and the feeling that more athletes should be given opportunities to take part. And so to that end, we saw the formation of the Asian Winter Games in 1986, and they still go today. The Asian Indoor Games were formed in 2005, and that was to allow indoor sports to proliferate. It didn't last long and it merged in 2009 with the Asian martial arts game. So if you know anything about Asia, you'll know they've got tons of martial arts that they practice. Rather than try to fit them all into the big Asian Games program, then they just set up their own games. And so we see the Asian indoor and martial arts games merging. So it's the combination of the Asian indoor games and the Asian martial arts games merging together since 2013, and they still carry on today. So that gives an Asian platform just for the key indoor sports and martial arts sports that aren't on the Asian Games program. We also have an Asian Youth Games, just like the Olympic Youth Games since 2009, and the Asian Beach Games, which includes beach volleyball and sailing and those kinds of beach type activities. Dragon boat racing is in there, and they are another way to get an Asian-wide games. And there was an Asian E-Games as well, but when I was doing my research for this lecture, I couldn't find the details, so I've left it out. But I'm sure if you give it some time and you are interested in esport, that you will find that they have dabbled into the world of E-Games as well, esport as well. So the Asian Games as a concept under the OCA recognized, as all sporting organizations should, all sporting organizations that are involved in proliferating sport, that owning a product is the way forward. With a product, you make money. The OCA have a lot of products, as you can see, and so they are always involved in delivering some kind of a game somewhere in Asia. And with that comes TV rights, commercial sponsorship, and everything else. And to that end, that's why if you start looking at highlights from different Asian games and different forms of it, you'll be pretty impressed with the level of technology that's being delivered, with the innovations that they have in terms of putting on games. I mean, if any of you ever watched the Beijing 2008 opening ceremony and closing ceremony, and even the Winter Games opening and closing, and the Tokyo opening and closing, you'd be pretty amazed at just what they were able to deliver. In Japan, they had facial recognition software for the first time. So instead of everybody wearing a card around their neck as an accreditation, you just had your face scanned and that was it. So you walk past the scanner, they can see who you are, whether you should be where you're supposed to be, and so on. So yeah, they are the ones doing all of this kind of innovation. So I suppose the takeaway from the lecture is that the Asian Games provide a lot of competition for many more sports than the Olympics. And they also provide it at a level which is from a little bit below Olympic level to actual Olympic level. And it provides a good link between other competitions that are happening in the region and aspiring athletes who want to reach Olympic level competition. I would suggest that obviously China's put a lot of money into the development of their sport and the preparation of their athletes, but without the Asian Games to actually get their athletes out and compete on a regular basis, and compete very successfully, mind you, I would suggest that their success in world sport would not have been nearly as effective as it has been. It is seen as the largest mainstream multi-sport event in the world, so that's why I said very interesting that nobody's really heard of it. It's a lot bigger than the Commonwealth Games. It's probably twice the size of the Commonwealth Games, with 3 or 4 times the budget, and the number of countries that take part is not as well. No, it's not as many as in the Commonwealth Games, but many, many more athletes and more sports do take part in the Asian Games. It's made many innovations, and most of these innovations, when they've occurred, have been almost immediately adopted by the Olympic movement. So I know that a lot of the technological advancement, information technology innovations that occur in delivering Olympic Games these days, much of it is based on work that's been done at the Asian Games. What was the number of, or how many countries have not yet won a gold medal at the Asian Games? I think it's 7. When I did the look at it, it was about 7 of them, but it might be less than that. But there's still, out of the 45 countries that take part, there's still 7 that haven't won it. And that's actually not too bad when you compare it to the Olympics. And I am willing to be corrected on that. I think if you go away and look at the medal tallies and then have a look through and see which countries haven't won a gold medal yet, just count them up, you'll see it. It's around 5 to 7, something like that. And one of the reasons for this is if you look at those countries that are involved, then you're going to notice that they're quite undeveloped countries, at least from a sporting perspective. You know, they might be, a couple of them might surprise us that they haven't, but if they haven't got a sports system, or if they haven't been able to get their athletes away from their country and take part in competitions elsewhere, then they won't really have a chance. It's fascinating that should be the case, because small countries really have less chances of winning medals in any multi-sport competition against the economic might that is brought to bear by some of the larger countries. But you might also be surprised too at just how few, relatively, compared to their size, countries like India, Pakistan have done. These are all countries with good sporting traditions and particularly strong cultures in sport, but are not necessarily able to bring that to a multi-sport event like the Asian Games. There are many, many, many more questions we could ask about that, but as you go through this globalization process and understanding the globalization of sport, if you can really think about how the multi-sport games have globalization to occur, how that's been facilitated by the process of globalization itself, and then ultimately what the dynamics and what the right and wrongs, if you like, are when it comes to hosting such events, whether they're economically viable to do, which most people use that as an excuse to host a game, which is to make money and build infrastructure. Is that a viable excuse for hosting a games? And are the benefits of hosting these kinds of events, can measure it with the costs? These are all little controversies that you might want to ponder and think about when it comes to putting an essay together at the end of this module. It's got dark here all of a sudden in Chengdu. I'm in the dark, but you're still enjoying a nice light day, I hope. And so I wish you the very best and hope we will see you again someday, maybe even out here. All the very best. Thank you.